Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Jamieson Greer is joining us now. Jamieson, Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. I know you've been incredibly busy. I can imagine you haven't slept much. I am curious how much we're seeing the end of negotiations or the beginning of the end, as there still seem to be some loose ends to be tied up.
Well, I would say that, we've spent the past 120 days negotiating with dozens and dozens of countries, and with some of these countries, the deals have been good enough that the president's been willing to accept them. With other countries, they're just going to have a tariff. But we have, you can look at some of the information that's gone out there. We have fact sheets. We have a joint statement with Indonesia that gives some details. We'll be finishing the paperwork in the next, weeks and maybe a couple of months. But these deals are pretty much set. They are set, right? We wouldn't make an agreement unless we all knew the contours of it, and the countries knew it. And it's an exciting time because the president has essentially reset the global trading system, and so we'll be, finalizing everything that's been agreed to on paper and then monitoring compliance going forward.
Ambassador Greer, can you help us understand how you landed on some of these rates? Specifically, a country like Switzerland, it went from 31% on Liberation Day, April 2nd, to now 39%, even though you and your colleagues were in negotiations with the Swiss trading partners.
Sure. Well, so first of all, the rates are largely determined by the trade deficit of a country with the United States and what the country's willing to do to address that trade deficit. Switzerland, this is surprising to some to hear, but we have a nearly $40 billion trade deficit with Switzerland for a country of 9 million. Now, we value our relationship with Switzerland, certainly, but during our discussions with them, we weren't able to reach agreement on the best way to reduce that trade deficit at all, right? They ship enormous amounts of pharmaceuticals to our country. We want to be making pharmaceuticals in our country. So this is a challenging situation, and so we have high tariffs, not just on Switzerland, but many countries where we weren't able to fully resolve a path forward on reducing the trade deficit and opening markets.
My understanding was that the U.S. and Switzerland actually had a negotiated text, and it was just waiting on sign-off from President Trump. Is that accurate?
I think that's an overstatement. I mean, the reality is all of these countries, you trade back and forth paperwork, and then you take it back to your leaders to get guidance from them. And so nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. That's what every trade negotiator knows. So, the reality is we negotiate with lots of countries. Listen, there are a lot of countries that didn't get the deal that we've been negotiating with. And of course, they all want a deal. They all want a deal with the United States. So I can understand that, folks may want to try to manifest a deal in the last minutes. But we just have to do what's right for America, and the president understands that too.
I'm thinking of other countries like Taiwan, which that rate went down. India, Switzerland, of course, we know you are in negotiations with. So between now and August 7th, could some of these countries that you spent a lot of time with your counterparts get a deal?
Well, that's not my focus. I feel like we've been able to get everything set on August 1st. Of course, any country that wants to talk to us, they can always talk to us. And I'm sure some will be eager to find ways to reduce the deficit, open their markets, et cetera. But we're really focused right now on implementing the deals that have been reached.
Well, on implementing those deals, Representative, you mentioned that you would be looking and monitoring them for any violations. How will this administration judge what is a violation and what the consequences of that would be?
So, for example, we put out a fairly detailed joint statement with Indonesia, and we're finalizing the underlying agreement. And in there, you can see that they've made commitments on tariff levels where they're going to remove all of their tariffs. They've made commitments on non-tariff barriers with respect to, agricultural inspections and the way they, treat certain digital trade. And so our office, which has hundreds of people, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, they watch this and they make sure that Indonesia actually does what it's supposed to do. And if they don't, the president has his tariff authority. I mean, all of the deals are premised, and the modified rates for these countries are premised on them actually opening their market, making the investment and purchase commitments they've agreed to. And if you don't, you can have the tariffs go back into place. This is basic trade enforcement. That's what we intend to do here.
Ambassador, right now there are a number of countries coming out and saying this is part of a negotiation, and they plan to keep talking with the team over in the trade organization and trade representatives from the United States. Is that just messaging to their own political constituents, or is that reality?
Well, listen. They certainly have their domestic constituents they have to talk to. You can be sure that I woke up this morning to a number of trade ministers texting me and emailing me, and I'm sure they're reaching out to my colleagues, Secretary Lutnick, Secretary Besson, et cetera. And my job is to talk to these folks. I'm always going to talk to these folks, and if they have proposals, I'll talk to them and I'll brief the president. We're focused on implementation and doing what's right to change the trading system to one that benefits American workers.
How much are you also hearing from U.S. companies concerned about certainty and whether they're going to get clarity on exactly what the rates are going to be, whether they will stick, whether there will be adjustments, and how some of these things will work with transnational shipments of getting penalized 40%?
So with respect to certainty, President Trump has been talking about a new tariff program for literally years, decades in some instances. He has tariffs from his first term that are still in place. So sometimes when companies say we want certainty, what they mean is we want a different outcome, right? By putting, the market has baked in a lot of the tariffs we've put in. The new tariffs that we issued last night are firm. That's why we put it out in a very clear list. Everyone can see it and understand. With respect to transshipment, that's always been illegal. And so we're just going to put an additional 40% tariff on that. So, I understand that there are going to be edge cases where companies have to change their supply chains, and no one wants to do that. They just want status quo. But we can't have the status quo. The status quo is what led to offshoring and the loss of some of our key industries. So during that supply chain shift, that can be challenging for some companies. And I talk to a lot of these folks. I want them to understand the president's trade policy. I want to hear about any unintended consequences. But the president's trade policy is moving forward, and we're shifting from a 70-year policy based on purely efficiency to a new policy based on fair and balanced trade, and the world is agreeing with us.
Ambassador Greer, what about the unintended consequences of what's going on with the sectoral tariffs on autos? The Ford CEO was on Bloomberg television yesterday talking about the price disadvantage compared to auto companies if they're making a car in Japan because of the input costs of 25% on those inputs that they need to make the car coming to the United States versus the 15% rate that Japan now has. What's the point of the auto sectoral tariff if basically it's going to be bilateral now with country by country?
So first of all, there are only a handful of countries that export cars to us, right? It's essentially, Germany, Japan, and a couple of countries of the European Union. We also have Canada and Mexico, and we had our domestic producers, choose over a couple of decades to offshore a lot of that production to Mexico. And so naturally, there is some challenge as they continue to reshore that, and we understand that, right? I mean, our goal is long term. We're not looking at quarterly earnings as policymakers. We're looking at a way to make sure that we have a strong, robust industrial base here that provide good jobs for our workers and support the national security. So, we're in constant contact with the domestics, with the unions, and everybody. And, I understand that the auto companies are receiving a credit for content that's made in America, which is how it should be. That's what we're trying to incentivize.
When you're looking and you're thinking long term, are you preparing for a Supreme Court ruling against using AIPA for these tariffs? And if so, what's the plan B?
So the case is at the federal circuit right now. We had the arguments yesterday. Lots of questions, a lot of preparation. DOJ did a great job. We had a great team out there. We feel very confident in the case. If there's still questions coming out of the federal circuit or further litigation that goes to the Supreme Court, we're confident there that this statute clearly says the president has the authority to regulate imports. That's the language. No, not my words. That's the statute's language. In case there's a national emergency, the president's declared a national emergency. So we feel confident, if it goes the other way, then we'll manage that. The reality is the countries understand the type of leverage that President Trump has created. That's why they're doing these deals, and they're going to stick regardless of what happens in litigation.
That's where I wanted to finish, and we just have a couple of minutes. We are out of time with you, I know, but I am curious what the game plan is should there be some sort of overruling of AIPA. Do you already have Section 232 and others lined up?
Well, listen, we always have all kinds of plans, and I'm not going to go deep into our strategy here, mostly because we're pretty confident on the current plan, but we will do whatever it takes to make sure that the president can continue to rectify the trade deficit and change the global trading system. And this is a historic thing. This is once in 100 years that you have the chance to reorder global trade like this, and we're doing it, and we'll use whatever tools are necessary to do it.
U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, thank you so much for being with us.